Horrific murders. Investigation process. Portrait of the perpetrator. Motive for the crime. Final verdict. Welcome to Mysterious Case. Las Vegas, the city of dazzling lights, lavish dreams, and breathless gambles. Here, amid the clinking of slot machines and the sparkle of cocktails, lies a two-faced world. One side is a Disneyland for adults, where people come to play. The other is the everyday life of those who quietly operate this glamorous machine. Shauna Tia, a beautiful cocktail waitress at the Palms Casino, belonged to the latter. But fate dragged her into a horrifying drama where the stage lights dimmed, giving way to the cold darkness of crime. On the morning of September 29, 2012, a 911 call shattered the quiet of Summerlin, a peaceful suburb of Las Vegas. The trembling voice of George Tia, Shauna's husband, came through the line. "I think I need to report a break-in and a murder. My wife is lying on the floor, covered in blood, stiff, not moving." With George at the time was their 8-year-old daughter, Madison, who unwittingly became the first witness to the horrific scene. Her mother, Shauna, lying motionless in the living room, blood soaking her golden hair, her body brutally beaten beyond recognition. Police quickly arrived at the scene, a small townhouse in the Willowbrook Apartments complex. Shauna, 46, was still in her cocktail waitress uniform, a short skirt and torn fishnet stockings, though her clothing showed no signs of being disturbed. There was no evidence of sexual assault. Instead, they found chilling details. Her head smashed, fingers broken off, teeth scattered on the floor, and tiny wood splinters, remnants of a hammer destroyed in the killer's rage. But the weapon was gone, along with Shauna's wedding ring, her phone, and a pink bag that security cameras captured her carrying as she left her shift at 3:01 a.m. Who could have done this, and why? A random robbery? A predator lurking in Vegas's shadows? Or a deeper conspiracy woven from seemingly perfect relationships? The story begins to unfold, pulling us back in time to explore the lives of Shauna and George, a couple once emblematic of the American dream, before everything shattered into pieces. Shauna Tia was born on March 13, 1966, in Salt Lake City, Utah, into a strict Mormon family. One of 7 siblings, she grew up with a radiant smile and a lively personality. At 12, her family moved to Pennsylvania, then later to Virginia, where Shauna stood out at South Lakes High School. A cheerleader, she was remembered by friends as feminine, outgoing, always full of energy. Graduating in 1984, Shauna seemed destined for a bright future, but the Wild West always seemed to call her. In 1994, at 28, Shauna left the East Coast for Las Vegas, not to chase the glitz, but to be closer to her sister Paula. She initially worked at upscale stores like Saks Fifth Avenue and Neiman Marcus, but Vegas, with its allure, drew her into the casino industry. From waitressing at Fiesta, she moved to the Palms when it opened in 2001. There, Shauna found her passion. Mixing cocktails wasn't just a job, it was a lifestyle. Colleagues remembered her as someone who always smiled, never frowned, a vibrant flower amid the casino's clamor. With a salary and tips nearing $100,000 a year, Shauna didn't just live well, she embraced the lavish life Vegas offered. While Shauna shone under the casino lights, George Tia entered her life like a figure stepping out of the American dream. Born in 1972, George grew up on a chicken farm in California, where he learned the value of hard work after his father's early death. A high school valedictorian, he went on to excel at the prestigious West Point Military Academy, serving in the Army Corps of Engineers and building water systems in developing countries. But an office job wasn't for George. He chose to become a firefighter in Las Vegas, a role demanding courage and dedication. George was a striking man, tall, handsome, once featured in a firefighter pinup calendar, with a smile and charm that turned heads. He was a family man, often sending money home to help his mother care for his disabled sister. When he met Shauna at the Palms in 2002, he was drawn to her diligence and energy. Just a year later, they welcomed Madison, and on March the 16th, 2006, 3 days after Shauna's 40th birthday, they married on a Hawaiian beach in a picture-perfect ceremony. Wedding photos showed a joyful couple, a flawless family of three, George, Shauna, and Maddie, the light of their lives. But dreams don't last forever. The Great Recession of 2008 hit America hard. In Las Vegas, a city reliant on tourism and casinos, took a severe blow. George lost money in the collapsing real estate market, and financial strain began seeping into their marriage. Shauna, accustomed to easy earnings and lavish spending, became a target of George's criticism. He grew jealous, controlling, even insulting her in front of Maddie, calling her a slut as she got ready for work. Small cracks widened into a chasm. The breaking point came when George brought a homeless man named Nol Stevens into their home for odd jobs. Shauna felt uneasy, calling him creepy, but George brushed it off. By April 2012, after nearly a decade together, Shauna decided to leave, moving into her own townhouse and sharing custody of Maddie with George. She wasn't ready to give up entirely, partly for Maddie, partly out of an optimistic belief that things could be salvaged. They began marriage counseling that summer, but those efforts seemed merely a facade masking an approaching storm. 3 weeks before her death, Shauna's home was broken into. The thief took her wedding ring and a swimsuit, leaving behind a strange pair of small boxer briefs. Shauna, ever the optimist, didn't upgrade her security or report it to the police. On the night of September 28th into the early hours of the 29th, after a long shift at the Palms, Shauna drove home, exhausted and stressed. She stepped into her dark hallway, unaware that a shadowy figure awaited, hammer in hand, ready to seal her fate. The story is only beginning. Who was behind Shauna's death? George, the husband with a seemingly airtight alibi? Or a stranger in the night? The mystery starts to unravel, but each clue leads to an even more unexpected turn. When Las Vegas police entered Shauna Tia's townhouse on the morning of September 29th, 2012, they faced a scene that unnerved even seasoned investigators. Blood pooled across the living room floor, seeping into the carpet, staining Shauna's golden hair red. Her body lay supine, rigid. Shattered fingers, scattered fingernails, and a few dislodged teeth suggested she had fought back. But to no avail. The murder weapon was missing, but tiny wood splinters on the floor pointed to a hammer destroyed in the savage attack. This was no random killing. It was deliberate, fueled by rage. Yet the biggest question lingered. Who did this? And why had Shauna, a well-liked woman with no obvious enemies, become the victim of such a horrific crime? As an unwritten rule in homicide cases, the police's first glance often falls on the spouse, especially when the marriage was fractured, as it was with George and Shauna. George Tia, the one who called 911 with a trembling voice, immediately became a suspect. He was a respected firefighter, a West Point alumnus, a man colleagues described as kind, generous, reliable. But could that perfect exterior hide something darker? George claimed that morning he had gone to Shauna's house with their daughter Madison to pick up some items. Upon entering, he found his wife dead on the floor and immediately called the police. His account seemed genuine, but investigators weren't easily swayed. They dug into George's movements over the previous 24 hours. He stated he'd worked a 24-hour shift at the fire station, leaving early that morning, then stopped at a supermarket before picking up Maddie from his mother's house. Every detail checked out. Security footage from the fire station showed him on duty throughout his shift. Receipts and supermarket video confirmed his presence there, and both his mother and Maddie verified he'd picked her up around 8 a.m. There were no gaps in his timeline. George couldn't have been at the scene when Shauna was killed, estimated between 3:30 and 7 a.m., based on a neighbor's report of a thud in the open garage door. George's alibi was airtight, but suspicion didn't fade. Investigators, led by Terry Miller and Dan Long of the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, wondered if he played a different role. Not the direct killer, but a puppet master pulling strings from afar. The broken marriage, money disputes, and George's jealousy over Shauna's new relationship with another man all offered potential motives. Yet with no concrete evidence, they set him aside for the moment to pursue other leads. The crime scene revealed little. No foreign DNA, no unusual fingerprints, only Shauna's and those of people familiar in her life. The garage door was wide open when police arrived, but there were no signs of forced entry. The killer had seemingly entered with ease, perhaps with a key or through an unlocked passage. Neighbors heard no screams, just a vague thud around 3:30 a.m. from the person next door, and another reported the garage door open by 7 a.m. This narrowed the timeline of the crime but wasn't enough to pinpoint a suspect. The missing items, Shauna's wedding ring, phone, and the pink bag she carried when leaving the Palms, suggested a robbery. Yet other valuables like her wallet, credit cards, and electronics remained untouched. If it was a robbery, why would the thief take trinkets instead of more valuable items? And was the break-in 3 weeks earlier, when her wedding ring and swimsuit were stolen, leaving behind a pair of small boxer briefs, connected? Investigators began to suspect this wasn't a random act, but a carefully planned scheme. They turned their attention to the Palms, where Shauna worked. Security footage showed her leaving her shift at 3:01 a.m., walking to the parking lot with her pink bag, showing no signs of being followed or distressed. Colleagues described her as cheerful, friendly, with no enemies. No suspicious customers stood out, and Shauna's secret boyfriend, a mostly physical relationship, had a solid alibi. He was working at the casino, confirmed by footage and witnesses. Every lead seemed to steer police into a labyrinth with no exit. The case appeared to stall until 2 days later, when a man named William Panks, nicknamed Big Will, walked into the police station with an unbelievable story. Big Will, an ex-convict now working maintenance at an apartment complex, claimed he knew Shauna's killer. He said a friend nicknamed Greyhound had come to him in September and confessed, "I just killed a woman." Greyhound, according to Big Will, showed no remorse. He laughed, bragging that he'd smashed the victim with a hammer over and over until it broke, and that he'd be paid handsomely to leave Vegas. This detail stunned investigators. They hadn't released to the media that the murder weapon was a hammer, let alone that it had broken during the attack. Big Will couldn't have fabricated this, unless he was directly involved. To test him, they administered a polygraph. The result, he passed with flying colors, showing no signs of deception. Big Will might be the key to finding the killer. Greyhound, whose real name was Nol Stevens, was an ex-convict living homeless in a tent in the foothills, 8 miles from the Las Vegas Strip. Big Will led police to a gas station near an Albertsons, where Stevens often hung out to buy liquor or sell drugs. And, as if by miracle, they found him there, loitering with his pockets stuffed with marijuana. Arrested for drug possession, Stevens denied any involvement in Shauna's murder. "I didn't kill nobody," he growled, his wild eyes and stammering voice betraying his instability. But when pressed about the money for the drugs, he slipped up, dropping a name. George Tia. He's my friend." The name George Tia rang like an alarm bell. Shauna's husband, the man with a perfect alibi, was linked to a strange homeless man now suspected of being the killer. The investigators exchanged glances, hearts pounding. This was no mere coincidence. This was the moment the veil of mystery began to lift, exposing a conspiracy darker than anyone could have imagined. Stevens was detained, and the police launched a large-scale search of his campsite. Under the scorching desert sun, they climbed rocky hills, even deploying helicopters to scour the area. Finally, near Stevens' tent, they uncovered a pair of rolled-up jeans stuffed under a bush. The jeans were caked with dried blood. DNA testing confirmed it was Shauna's blood. Inside the jeans, Stevens' DNA was found, undeniable proof that he was the one who struck. Nearby, they dug up a broken hammer, its wooden handle splintered, the metal head stained with blood. A barcode on the hammer traced it to Lowe's, where security footage captured Stevens purchasing it, but he wasn't alone. Another man appeared in this video standing beside Stevens, smiling as they chose the murder weapon. George Tia. The mystery was no longer about who killed Shauna, but why, and what George's true role was in this conspiracy. The story entered a new chapter, where the truth began to emerge, cold and merciless. As Las Vegas Metro investigators reviewed the Lowe's footage, the image of George Tia and Nol Stevens together, buying the hammer that took Shauna's life, came into sharp focus. They knew they were on the right track, a chilling conspiracy. George, the husband with an airtight alibi, and Stevens, the unstable homeless man, weren't just acquaintances. They were two ends of a thread tied together by greed, desperation, and a calculated murder plot. But the bigger question remained. What drove a man like George, a symbol of courage and honor, down this dark path? And what role did Stevens, a man on society's fringes, play in this deadly drama? The connection between Shauna Tia and Nol Stevens didn't begin with a shady deal in the shadows. It sprouted in the mundane days on a middle-class Las Vegas street when Stevens lived with his sister just a few doors down from George and Shauna. Stevens, an ex-convict with a troubled past, was drawn to George, a successful firefighter, a West Point graduate, exuding the confidence and achievement Stevens never had. George, with his generous nature, often hired Stevens for odd jobs, mowing the lawn, fixing the fence, or cleaning the garage. To Stevens, George wasn't just an employer. He idolized him, seeing him as a friend, a role model. But Shauna wasn't at ease with Stevens' presence. She called him creepy, unsettled by how he lingered around the house, his wild eyes and stammering voice sending chills down her spine. She once told friends that Stevens' appearances made her uncomfortable, even sensing he was dangerous. George dismissed her complaints, perhaps because he had already calculated that this homeless man could become the knife in his hand. When Stevens left his sister's house and slipped into a life of camping in the foothills, his connection with George didn't break. They stayed in touch, and Stevens continued doing odd jobs whenever George needed him. But by the summer of 2012, as George and Shauna's marriage teetered on the edge of collapse, that relationship took a darker turn. The Great Recession of 2008 had left deep scars on George and Shauna's lives. George, who had invested in real estate, lost a substantial sum when the market crashed. Las Vegas, a city reliant on tourism and gambling, reeled as unemployment soared to 14%. While Shauna still pulled in nearly $100,000 a year from her cocktail waitressing job, George, with his more modest firefighter salary, began to feel the financial strain. Shauna loved to spend: new flooring, new rugs, a new bathtub, things that pleased her but infuriated George. He frequently criticized her spending habits, sometimes in front of Maddie, cutting Shauna deeply. Financial tension was just the beginning. When Shauna moved out in April 2012 and started seeing another man, George grew jealous and controlling. He couldn't stomach the thought of losing her, or, more crucially, losing Maddie, the light of his life. A text from Shauna shortly before the murder, in which she affirmed her desire to stay separated, seemed to be the breaking point. "We agreed to split, and I think it should stay that way," she wrote. George read that message and a fear ignited within him. Shauna might seek full custody, tearing Maddie away from him forever. But murder wasn't a spur-of-the-moment thought. It was the product of a calculated plan, and Nol Stevens was the perfect tool in George's hands. Stevens, with his unstable mind and dependence on George, was easily manipulated. George knew this, and he exploited it. Evidence from Stevens's phone painted a chilling picture. 87 calls between him and George in September 2012, spiking in frequency in the 2 weeks before the murder. They weren't just talking, they were plotting. Initially, George wanted to stage an accident. Stevens would knock Shauna unconscious. George didn't just supply the idea, he was involved in every step. Footage from Lowe's showed him and Stevens buying the hammer, a knife, and gloves weeks before the crime. George even drew a map of the Palms parking lot, showing Stevens where Shauna parked to ambush her. But Stevens botched the first attempt. 2 weeks before the murder, he was caught near the Palms with a bag containing a mask, gloves, a knife, and a hammer. George quickly bailed him out, and the plan was adjusted. This time, they'd strike at Shauna's home. George gave Stevens a duplicated key to the townhouse. Stevens used it to break in multiple times, including the theft 3 weeks earlier, when he took Shauna's wedding ring and swimsuit, leaving behind the small boxer briefs as an odd marker. It wasn't a random robbery, it was a rehearsal for the real killing. On the night of September 28th, Stevens waited inside, hiding in the bathroom. When Shauna entered at 3:30 a.m., He lunged, swinging the hammer wildly. Shauna raised her hands to defend herself, screaming, "Why?" But Stevens didn't answer. He struck until the hammer broke in two, leaving her in a pool of blood, then grabbed her purse, wedding ring, and fled through the garage, leaving the door open as a signal to George that the deed was done. The next morning, George brought Maddie to Shauna's house. Seeing the garage door open, he knew the plan had succeeded. But instead of entering himself, he let Maddie go first, a callous act that forced the 8-year-old to face her mother's battered body. When he called 911, his voice trembled, but investigators now suspected it was an act. Stevens was arrested at the gas station, and under police pressure and a promise to avoid the death penalty, he confessed everything. He pointed to George as the mastermind, led police to the buried hammer, and recounted every detail: the calls, the shopping trip, the garage door signal. Red flags went up at this point. I'm not sure how many times I've said this, but I'll say it again. I am not a lawyer, but I can tell you that this is a case of a man who was convicted of murdering his wife, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The jury didn't buy the defense's argument that the key witness was unreliable, and they convicted him on all counts, including first-degree murder. He's now serving a life sentence without parole. Stevens, under a plea deal in 2013, was sentenced to 42 years to life. The case closed, but the pain left for Maddie, losing both her mother and father at once, is indelible. On September 3, 2015, as the jury delivered its guilty verdict against George Tia, the Las Vegas courtroom was steeped in two opposing emotions. On one side stood Shauna's family, led by her sister Paula Richards, exhaling a collective sigh of relief after 3 long years awaiting justice. They wore pink, Shauna's favorite color, as a tribute to the woman who once brought smiles and light into their lives. Across the divide was George's family, with sobs and disbelieving stares as the man they cherished, a hero in a firefighter's uniform, was declared the mastermind behind his wife's murder. Yet amid this divide of joy and sorrow, a small figure was overlooked: Madison, the 8-year-old girl who had now lost both her mother and father in an indelible nightmare. The trial ended, but the story of Shauna and George, a once vibrant American dream beneath Las Vegas's lights, now lay in ashes. The aftermath of this crime wasn't just the sentences handed down, but the scars forever etched into the hearts of those left behind. At the sentencing hearing in December 2015, George Tia stood before the jury once more, his face impassive and unchanged, as it had been throughout the trial. The prosecutor demanded a life sentence without parole, arguing that George's brutality and calculation deserved no mercy. Paula took the stand, her voice breaking as she spoke of her sister. Shauna lived for Maddie. She'd always brush her hair, call her monkey. George didn't just take my sister's life. He took the best mother Maddie ever had. Her words cut like a blade, a reminder of the true cost of this case. George's family and friends also spoke, pleading for leniency. His sister, Maria, described him as one of the best people, a devoted and compassionate man. George isn't the monster they say he is, she insisted, tears streaming down her face. But those pleas couldn't alter the facts. George had planned his wife's murder with chilling precision, even allowing his own daughter to witness the aftermath. The jury remained unmoved. George was sentenced to life without parole, while Nol Stevens, the man who delivered the fatal blows, had already received 42 years to life in 2013 after pleading guilty and cooperating with police. George didn't give up easily. In 2017, from prison, he penned a 100-page appeal himself, alleging ineffective counsel and claiming he'd been influenced by painkillers from a firefighting injury. He even asserted that God told him to kill Shauna to protect Maddie. The court dismissed it outright, calling his scheme deceitful, rogue, and ruthless. George would never leave the bars behind. If Shauna was a victim of the hammer and blood, Maddie was a victim of a lifetime of pain. In 2012, at just 8 years old, she walked into her mother's home and faced a horrific sight. Shauna lying motionless, blood soaking the floor, her eyes vacant. George, the father she loved, not only indirectly caused that death, but deliberately thrust her into that scene, an act later described by psychologists as cruel beyond imagination. Maddie lost her mother, and her father was imprisoned forever just a few years later. After the case, Maddie moved in with her paternal grandmother, George's mother, in Las Vegas. Paula and her husband, John Richards, though living in Nashville, frequently flew in to visit, trying to fill the void Shauna left behind. When I talk about Shauna, I see Maddie smile, a smile just like her mother's, Paula once said. I know she misses the days they laughed together. In 2023, Maddie graduated high school, a milestone neither Shauna nor George could witness. Paula promised that when Maddie was old enough, she'd tell her the full truth. Not to inflict more pain, but to help her understand why her father could never return. But can Maddie ever move past that memory? The image of her mother beaten to death and her father's betrayal may haunt her for life. The girl who was once the light of George and Shauna now must find her own way through the darkness they left behind. For Paula Richards, Shauna's death was an irreparable loss. From the moment she heard her sister was gone, she suspected George. A recorded call right after the murder, when Paula confronted George outside the crime scene, showed her instincts were spot on. I suspected he was involved, based on what Shauna had told me, she said to her husband at the time. When the truth came out, Paula felt both relief and anguish. Justice was served, but I've still lost Shauna forever, she told the press after the trial. George's family, on the other hand, fell into denial and devastation. His mother, who once relied on the money he sent to care for his disabled sister, couldn't fathom her son's fall. His siblings, Maria and Bernarde, staunchly defended his character, calling the accusations ridiculous. But the undeniable evidence severed all hope. They lost George not to death, but to the reality that he was no longer the man they once knew. The Shauna Tia case is not just a crime story. It's a warning about how unseen pressures can turn people into monsters. George, once a symbol of courage, let greed and jealousy guide him. Finances, love, and the fear of losing control drove him into a ruthless conspiracy. Nol Stevens, a man cast aside by society, became a tool in George's hands, but also a testament to the danger of unstable minds when manipulated by a schemer. Technology played a pivotal role in uncovering the truth. From the 87 calls between George and Stevens, to the Lowe's footage, to the DNA on Stevens' jeans, each digital and physical piece built a complete picture of the crime. These days, you can't escape your trail, investigator Dan Long once said. Phones, cameras, DNA, they're all silent witnesses. But above all, this case is a human tragedy. Shauna, with her radiant smile and unshakable optimism, deserved a happier life. George, with his talent and dedication, could have been a true hero, and Maddie, an innocent child, didn't deserve the pain her parents left behind. Las Vegas, the city of lights and opportunity, became the stage for one of its darkest, most sorrowful dramas. Shauna is gone forever, her smile now only a memory for those who loved her. George lives behind bars, stripped of the control he feared losing most. Maddie grows up amid the wreckage of her family, with a fragile hope that she might one day find peace. And Nol Stevens, the man who wielded the hammer, pays for a crime he didn't conceive alone. Beneath Las Vegas's glittering lights, their story reminds us, the brightest glow can hide the deepest shadows. Justice was served, but its cost was a shattered family, a stolen life, and a child forever scarred. In a city where everything is a gamble, Shauna, George, and Maddie all lost, not to fate, but to human choices gone terribly wrong.